What would you do if the law itself came riding onto your land, waved a stamped paper you had never signed, and told you the ranch your father broke his back to build was no longer yours? In Dry Creek, 38-year-old Walter Foster lost every acre of the Foster place to a sheriff's rigged deed and a courthouse full of borrowed lies. Kept out of pity only the sagging barn he was ordered to tear down before sundown Sunday. But what he pulled from beneath that barn floor, wrapped in oilcloth and buried under 40 years of dust, would take back more than the land it stole. Settle in, pour something warm, and let us know where you're watching from tonight, because this one earns every mile. The wagon rolled into Dry Creek the way a beaten dog comes home, slow and low to the ground, wheels squealing against a hub Walter had meant to grease 3 towns back. The sun was already going copper over the ridge. Dust hung in the air the way it always did in late September, fine as sifted flour, coating the storefronts and the tongues of the men leaning against them. Walter kept his eyes on the road between his horse's ears. He did not look at the saloon porch. He did not look at the mercantile steps. He knew who was watching, and he knew what they were watching for. He had ridden out of Dry Creek 6 weeks ago, a landowner. He was riding back in a man with a duffel, a rifle, and a folded court paper in his coat pocket that told him he had until Sunday to be gone. The Foster Ranch sat 2 miles north of town, at the crook where the creek bent hard against the base of the hills. His father had drawn water out of that bend for 31 years. His mother had died in the front room of the house that no longer belonged to him. He had buried them both under the cottonwood at the west fence, and he had spent every dollar and every daylight hour of the last decade trying to keep the deed clean, the taxes paid, the fences tight. None of it had mattered. Sheriff Rennick Boyd had wanted the Foster water. Sheriff Rennick Boyd had gotten it. The papers had come out of the county seat with a seal so fresh the wax was still warm, and the judge who signed them had not looked Walter in the eye once. Walter pulled the wagon up at the gate and sat there a long moment, with the reins slack in his hands. The house looked smaller than he remembered. The barn behind it looked older. A tin lantern hung crooked from the porch post, swinging a little in the wind that came down off the hills at this hour, and the sound of it, that soft, empty ticking of metal on wood, was the loneliest thing he had heard in his life. He climbed down. His boots hit the dirt of a place that was no longer his. Somewhere behind him, back in town, a man laughed loud enough to carry. The order Sheriff Boyd had handed him in front of the courthouse was specific in a way that was meant to sting. Walter was allowed to take his horse, his rifle, his personal effects, and whatever he could load in one wagon by Sunday noon. Everything else, the cattle, the tack, the standing timber, the well pump, the house itself, was now the property of the county, pending sale. And the barn, that leaning gray barn his grandfather had raised in 1849, with green pine and prayer, the barn Boyd called an eyesore and a hazard, was to be pulled down by Walter's own hands before he left. Not sold, not spared, torn down and stacked, so the new owner would inherit clean ground. Boyd had grinned when he said it. He had leaned in close enough that Walter could smell the pomade in his mustache and the whiskey behind his teeth, and he had said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "Foster, that barn's the only thing on your place worth less than you are. Have it flat by Sunday, or I'll flatten you with it." The crowd on the boardwalk had laughed, not all of them, but enough. Enough that Walter had felt the laughter settle into his shoulders like a second coat he would be wearing for a long time. He had said nothing. He had folded the paper. He had tipped his hat, once, to no one in particular, and he had walked to his wagon with the slow, measured steps of a man who knew that if he hurried he would break. Now, standing at the gate of a place that still smelled like his mother's lye soap and his father's pipe, Walter looked past the house to the barn. It sagged worse than he remembered. The west wall bowed outward, where a beam had shifted after the last hard winter. The doors hung crooked on their strap hinges. Pigeons lived in the loft. A square of tin roofing had peeled back and curled toward the sky like a page in a book no one was reading anymore. Worthless, Boyd had called it. Every man in Dry Creek would have said the same. A wind-eaten shell of green pine, held up by habit. Walter stood in the failing light and looked at that barn for a long time. Would you have walked away from a place already lost? Would you have swung the first hammer at a wall your grandfather raised with his own hands, just because a badge told you to? And what if the thing that Badge most wanted torn down was the very thing hiding what would undo him? Stay with us. Leave a word below. Tell a friend. Because what Walter Foster found under that barn floor was older than the sheriff, older than the deed, and patient enough to wait 40 years for a man honest enough to dig. He did not sleep in the house that night. He could not bring himself to cross a threshold that was no longer his to cross. He unrolled his bedding on the barn floor instead, between the two center posts, with his saddle for a pillow and the old blue roan mare tied at the stall behind him, breathing slow and warm in the dark. Morning came slow and gray. Walter rose before the light had color, rolled his bedding tight, and stood in the barn doorway, watching the mist crawl off the creek. He had 4 days. 4 days to bring down a wall his grandfather had raised. 4 days to load a wagon, with what a man could carry, of 31 years. He needed a saw he did not own, a length of rope longer than any he kept, and lamp oil enough to work past dark. That meant town. That meant walking the boardwalk again, under the eyes that had laughed yesterday. He rode the blue roan in at mid-morning and tied her at the rail outside the mercantile. The bell above the door rang thin. Inside, conversation dropped by half, then rose again in a lower key, the way a river changes sound when a stone is dropped in it. Walter went to the back counter and asked for what he needed. The clerk, a narrow man named Harlan Doss, would not meet his eye. He wrote the order on brown paper and added the sum without a word. Walter counted coins onto the wood. Behind him, a woman whispered to another woman. He heard the shape of his own name in it. Out on the boardwalk, 2 ranch hands from the Millard place leaned against a post and watched him load the roan's saddlebag. One of them spat into the dust. "Heard the sheriff's given him till Sunday," the taller one said, loud enough to carry. "Heard he's tearing his own barn down for the pleasure of it," the other answered. "Man's got to be good at something." Walter did not turn. He tied the sack, checked the girth, and stepped up into the saddle. He had learned long ago that a still face was cheaper than a bruised knuckle, and lasted longer. He was halfway to the end of the street when a voice called his name from the shaded side of the feed store. Not loud, not mocking. He drew up. An old man sat on an upturned crate with a tin cup between his palms. His name was Ambrose Hale, and he had been old when Walter was a boy. He had trapped in these hills before there was a town to speak of, and he still wore the same beaded band on his hat that the years had faded to the color of bone. He looked up at Walter, with eyes the pale blue of shallow ice. "Foster," Ambrose said. "Sir." The old man tilted his head toward the north, toward the crook of the creek where the ranch lay. He held Walter's gaze a long moment. His voice, when it came, was thin and formal, as if quoted from some older book. "What your grandfather buried, boy, he buried facing the door. Look where the light falls first." Walter waited for more. There was no more. Ambrose lifted the tin cup to his mouth and drank, and the conversation was finished. Walter touched his hat and rode on with the words settling into him, like grit into a boot. Uncomfortable, unplaceable, meant to be walked with, until they wore through to meaning. He was nearly clear of town when Sheriff Rennick Boyd stepped out of the land office and into the street, thumbs hooked in his belt, and made a show of squinting up at him. "Foster, thought you'd be swinging a hammer by now. Buying tools," Walter said. "Tools." Boyd laughed, and the men on the boardwalk laughed with him, because that was the arrangement. "Only man I ever knew to buy tools to make himself poorer. Sunday noon, Foster, I'll be riding out to count what's left standing. If one board of that barn is upright, I'll finish the job with you inside it." Walter looked down at him from the saddle and did not answer. He tapped the roan with his heel and rode north out of Dry Creek without looking back, and the laughter behind him thinned into the sound of the wind moving in the cottonwoods along the road. The ride home took the better part of an hour. The sky went from gray to a bruised silver as clouds pushed in low off the ridge, and by the time the ranch gate came into view, a fine cold rain had begun, more mist than fall, silvering the grass and darkening the boards of the barn to the color of iron. Walter unsaddled the roan, rubbed her down with a piece of sacking, and turned her into the stall. Then he stood at the barn door with the sack of tools at his feet and looked at what he had come home to tear apart. Up close it was worse than from the gate. The sill on the west side had rotted through, where the ground pooled after storms, and the bottom two courses of siding wore a dark green skirt of moss. Rain slid in a bright, thin line off the curled tin roofing and struck the dirt beside his boot with a small, steady beat. A pigeon shifted in the loft and set loose a drift of dust that fell through the gray light like slow snow. Boyd was not wrong. That was the ugly part. By any account a man could make, it was a shell held up by memory. He stepped inside anyway. The smell hit him first, the way it always had, that layered smell of old hay and axle grease, and horse, and something mineral underneath, that he had never named. He walked the length of the center aisle slowly, one hand trailing along the wood of the stalls, letting his fingers read what his eyes had stopped seeing years ago. The grain of the posts, the dark hollows where his father had driven nails and drawn them out again. A single initial, W, scratched at knee height by his own 6-year-old hand, and forgotten until this moment. He did not begin tearing anything down that day. He told himself it was the rain. He told himself he needed to plan the sequence of the walls. In truth, he could not yet lift a hammer against it. He built a small fire in the tin stove he had used for shoeing, boiled coffee in a black pot, and sat on an overturned bucket by the west wall while the rain thickened outside, and the light went from silver to the deep, slow blue that comes before full dark. Ambrose Hale's words moved in his head like a fly in a bottle, facing the door, where the light falls first. He looked at the wide double doors at the south end of the barn, then along the packed dirt floor to see where morning light would strike when the doors were thrown open at dawn. The line ran along the western row of stalls and ended at the foot of the second center post. He marked the spot in his mind and did nothing about it. Not that night. He unrolled his bedding again, in the same place as before, blew out the lantern, and lay listening. The roan breathed. The rain slowed. A beam settled somewhere overhead, with a soft, deliberate creak, as if the barn itself had turned in its sleep to face him. He slept lighter than he meant to. Somewhere in the small hours, a sound came from the western row of stalls, not the roan, and not the pigeons, a dry tap he could not place. He opened his eyes without moving. The rain had stopped. The barn held that particular hush that follows wet weather, wood swelling in the joints, water finding its way down old channels in the siding. The tap came again. 3 slow beats, then nothing. He counted his own breathing until it did not come a third time, and then he turned his head toward the second center post. Morning arrived thin and clean. Walter rose stiff from the boards and pushed the south doors open with his shoulder. Light poured across the packed dirt in a long, pale wedge, exactly as he had traced it in his mind the night before. The wedge caught the western row of stalls, ran the length of the aisle, and stopped at the base of the second center post. He stood in the doorway and watched it. For a long moment he did nothing but watch. Dust moved in the light. The blue roan snorted behind him and shifted her weight, and the sound seemed to belong to the light itself. Walter walked to the post. He crouched. He put his palm flat on the dirt where the light ended, and felt the ground with the whole of his hand. The earth there was cooler than the earth on either side. Not by much, just enough. He pressed with the heel of his hand, and the surface gave the faintest yield, no more than the width of a fingernail, and then held. He sat back on his heels. He looked up along the post. His grandfather had squared it from green pine in 1849, and the years had polished the wood to the color of dark honey, where hands and shoulders had worn it. He had passed this post 10,000 times. He had never looked at its foot. Now, in the low, horizontal light, he saw a mark cut into the wood at ankle height, on the side that faced the door. It was small, a shallow arrow, no longer than a thumb, pointing down at the dirt. The cuts were old, filled with dust and darkened by years, and unless a man was on his knees at sunrise, with the doors thrown wide, he would never see it at all. Walter sat with the mark for a long time. He did not fetch a shovel. He did not scrape at the dirt. He had learned young that a thing hidden by a careful man deserved the same care to lift. He rose, closed the south doors, part way to keep the light steady, and went out to see to the roan. He fed her a measure of oats from the last of the grain barrel, and stood with a hand on her neck while she ate. The mare was 19 that spring, gray around the muzzle, sway in the back from too many winters, but her eye was clear, and she leaned into him the way she had leaned into his father before him. She had been foaled in the stall behind them. She had never slept a night off the place. Walter rested his forehead against the flat bone above her eye, and stayed there while she chewed. By the time he came back to the barn, the light had shifted off the post, and the wedge on the floor had narrowed and traveled east. He did not begin with the dirt. He began with the barn itself, the way a man opens a letter by turning it slowly in his hands before he breaks the seal. He fetched the new saw from the sack of tools and set to the west sill first, cutting away the punky wood in short measured strokes. He worked without hurry. The rot came out in wet handfuls the color of tobacco. Beneath it, the older heartwood was still sound, and he laid the pieces aside rather than throwing them, uncertain yet why he was saving anything from a barn he had been ordered to flatten. He climbed to the loft and pulled the curled tin back over its rafter, weighted it with a stone, and swept the pigeon droppings into a pile by the north wall. He tightened the strap hinges on the crooked doors with a stub of pencil, driven as a shim. Small work, the kind of work a man does when he cannot yet do the larger thing waiting for him. As his hands moved, the barn began to speak. He noticed what he had not noticed in years of use. The second center post did not match the first. The first was a single squared timber, straight-grained, driven deep. The second was jointed near the base, a shorter length pegged into a longer one, with a peg he could just see under a skin of old whitewash. He ran a thumb along the seam. It was tight, no gap, no wobble, and yet it was there, a joint no builder would choose unless he had a reason to open the ground beneath his post before he raised it. Walter said nothing aloud. He simply took a rag from his pocket and rubbed at the whitewash until the peg showed clean, oak against pine, darker than the rest. He worked through the afternoon. He cleared the western stalls of old tack and moldy hay. Under the third manger, he found a pair of his father's leather gloves, stiff as bark, and set them on a nail. Under the loose plank at the corner of the fourth stall, he found a tin box of horseshoe nails, and beside it, a folded square of newsprint from a year he did not recognize, brittle enough to crumble at the crease. He laid the newsprint flat on a beam without opening it. The roan stayed near him through all of it. When he moved to the loft, she stood beneath the ladder. When he crossed to the west wall, she turned her head to follow. When he stopped to drink from the tin cup, she came to the stall gate and blew warm breath across his shoulder. He fed her twice by hand, from the palm-flat cup of oats, and each time her whiskers brushed the calluses on his fingers, and he felt something inside him ease a small notch he had not known was tight. By late afternoon, he had cleared a working path from the south doors to the second center post. He had touched every board along the western row. He had learned 3 things his mind had not yet put into words. The sill had been replaced once, decades before he was born, by someone who cared enough to match the pine. The floor near the second post rang hollow when the heel of his boot struck it, and the 2 boards nearest the post were held down by square-cut nails, while every other board in the barn was held by round wire nails. He stood in the aisle with the saw in one hand and the rag in the other, and looked at those 2 boards until the light in the doorway went from gold to the color of a struck match. Then he set the saw down against the post, quietly, the way a man sets down a thing he means to pick up again in the morning. He slept badly. The dry tapping did not return, but the wind rose after midnight and worked at the loose tin until it sounded like someone knocking at a door far off. Before first light, Walter was up. He fed the roan by lantern, drank cold coffee from the pot, and stood in the aisle, waiting for the sun to find the south doors. When it did, he pushed them open until the light reached the second center post, and then he knelt with the claw of a hammer he had bought the day before. The square-cut nails came out slowly. They squealed against the boards, the way old iron does when asked to move after 40 years. He pried the first plank up and set it aside. He pried the second, and beneath both, there was a shallow bed of dry sand laid down as a moisture barrier, and beneath the sand there was oilcloth, folded once and pressed flat, gone the color of tallow with age. Walter did not reach for it right away. He sat back on his heels and looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has been waiting for, without knowing. He lifted the oilcloth in both hands. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it to the workbench under the east window, where the light was clean, and laid it down and unfolded it, one flap at a time. First a leather wallet, cracked at the fold, then a small canvas sack that clinked when it settled. Then a bound ledger no bigger than a Bible, the cover stamped in faded gilt, with the initials of the county land office, as it had been named before the war. Then, wrapped in a scrap of oilskin of its own, a bundle of letters tied with waxed string. Walter opened the ledger first. The handwriting inside was his grandfather's, and then it was not. The first 50 pages were a straight ranch accounting: calves sold, wire bought, taxes paid. Then, folded flat between 2 pages near the middle, there was a second document written in a different hand, dated 1852, listing 4 ranches by their creek boundaries, and beside each name, a sum of money, and beside each sum, a signature. One of those signatures was the name of the sheriff's father. The 4 ranches had all been lost to the county within the same 18 months, and the water on each had ended up in the same set of hands. Walter read the page twice. He read it a third time. He opened the wallet. Inside were deeds, 3 of them, folded and yellowed, filed but never recorded, held back by his grandfather, against a day someone might need them. He opened the canvas sack, 20 gold double eagles slid into his palm, dulled but not tarnished, heavy as small stones. He opened the letters last. They were written to his grandfather by a man who signed himself only as a clerk at the county seat, and they described in patient sentences how the seals had been switched, which judge had been bought, and where the true records had been hidden after the fire that was set to burn them. The last letter was dated the summer before Walter was born. Walter set the letters down and put both hands flat on the workbench and lowered his head until his forehead touched the wood between them. He did not weep. He breathed in and out through his nose until his shoulders came down from where they had climbed. Outside, the roan stamped once in her stall, as if she had been listening for him to be finished. He wrapped everything back into the oilcloth, all but one letter and one folded page from the ledger, which he slid inside his coat against his ribs. He carried the bundle up to the loft, laid it inside the empty grain bin, and covered it with an old horse blanket. He climbed down, closed the doors, and rode the blue roan out through the gate before the sun was fully clear of the ridge. He did not ride toward town. He rode east along the creek, up the shallow draw where the water ran clearest, thinking without hurry, letting the mare choose her pace. The morning was clean and cold, frost still held in the shaded hollows, and the smoke from a distant chimney rose straight as a plumb line against the sky. He had ridden perhaps a mile when he saw the smoke that did not belong. It was on the far side of the draw, low and dirty, wrong for a chimney. He turned the roan and pushed her up the slope. On the flat above, he found a wagon, tipped onto its side, against a stand of pine, one wheel spinning, the tongue snapped clean. A team of 2 mules stood shivering in the traces. Beneath the wagon, a man was pinned at the hip, and a woman crouched over him with her hands pressed to a gash on his forehead. And beside her, a boy of perhaps 7 stood white and silent, with a wet cloth in his fist. Walter swung down before the roan had stopped. He asked the woman one word. She said her husband's leg was under the axle. He looked and saw it was so. He unhitched the mules, one and then the other, and led them clear. He cut the canvas from the wagon bed with his knife and spread it on the ground. He found a length of pine limb, thick as his forearm, and jammed it under the wagon side and set his shoulder to it. The wagon lifted a hand's breadth. The woman dragged her husband free by the shoulders. The man made no sound, which was worse than a cry. Walter let the wagon down. He knelt by the man and felt along the leg. The bone was not through the skin, but the hip was wrong. He looked at the woman. He said, "My place, 2 miles. Follow me." She nodded once. He lifted the man across the roan's withers, steadied him with one hand, and walked the mare down the slope at a pace slow enough for the woman and the boy to keep beside him. The boy carried the wet cloth the whole way and did not drop it. At the ranch he laid the man on the bed in the front room, in the house that was not his until Sunday. He built a fire in the stove. He heated water. He tore a clean sheet into strips. He set the hip as best he could remember his father, setting a colt's leg once when he was a child, and the man passed out from the pain, which was a mercy. The woman sat by the bed with the boy pressed against her side. She told Walter her name and her husband's name, and that they had been coming through from the north, bound for her sister's place beyond the pass, and had lost the wheel on a rut hidden under leaves. Walter said only, "You are safe here." He said it once, and he meant it, and it was the first thing he had said aloud in the house since he had come home. By the second morning, the fever in the man had broken, and the woman had slept an hour in the chair beside him. Walter saddled the roan before sunrise, put the letter and the folded ledger page inside his coat against his ribs, and rode south, not toward Dry Creek but past it, down the wagon road that ran another 30 miles to the county seat. He rode through the day and into the dusk, and slept once, briefly, in a stand of cottonwoods along the road. He reached the county seat by noon of the following day. He went first to the office of a lawyer his father had once trusted, a man named Owen Marsh, spare and gray, who kept a small practice behind the land office. Owen Marsh read the letter through twice without speaking. He read the ledger page a third time with a magnifying lens. He set the lens down and looked at Walter over the tops of his spectacles. "These signatures," he said, "are the ones we buried in 52. He folded the page carefully, along its old crease. "Where is the rest?" "Safe," Walter said. "Keep it so. 2 days." Walter rode back the way he had come and reached the ranch by the second dusk. The man in the front room was sitting up against a bolster the woman had made from a rolled coat. The boy was asleep on a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. The roan drank at the trough until Walter thought she would not stop. Sunday came slow and cold. At mid-morning, Sheriff Rennick Boyd rode up the wagon road with 2 deputies behind him and reined in at the gate. He sat his horse and looked at the barn, which still stood, and at the house, in whose chimney a thin thread of smoke rose. His mustache was freshly oiled, his mouth open to say what he had come to say. Behind him, from the south road, came a second party. Owen Marsh rode at the head of it on a plain brown mare. Beside him rode a federal land agent Walter had never seen, and a clerk from the county seat with a satchel strapped across his chest. Behind them, at a distance the way townspeople keep when they do not yet know which way to lean, came perhaps a dozen riders from Dry Creek. Ambrose Hale rode among them on a mule, his beaded hatband bone pale in the gray light. Boyd's face did not change all at once. It changed the way a wall changes when a single stone is drawn from its base. Owen Marsh dismounted at the gate and walked to Boyd's stirrup and handed him a folded paper. Boyd read it. He read it again. He handed it back without a word. One of his deputies asked him something quietly, and Boyd shook his head once and told the man to be still. The federal agent spoke then, plain and short, the way men speak who have said the same words in many other yards. He said the deed transferring the Foster Ranch to the county was void. He said a federal inquiry would open in the morning into 4 transfers dating to 1852, and into every transfer that had followed from them. He said the sheriff would ride to the county seat with him that afternoon and would answer questions there, and that his badge would be held pending those answers. Boyd looked at Walter for the first time. His face was the color of old ash. He did not speak. Walter did not speak either. He met the sheriff's eyes and held them, and then looked away, because there was no need to press what the land had already settled. Boyd unpinned the badge from his coat and handed it down to the federal agent, who put it in his pocket without ceremony. Ambrose Hale rode his mule up to the porch and drew rein and looked once at the barn's second center post, still standing, still square. He said nothing. He touched the brim of his bone-banded hat and turned the mule and rode back down the road at the same slow pace he had come. The townspeople parted for him and did not laugh. The riders left one by one. Some of them raised a hand to Walter as they turned their horses. He raised his hand once in return, to no one in particular, and to all of them. That evening, Walter walked out to the west fence with a hammer and a nail he did not need, and stood a long while under the cottonwood where his father and mother were buried. The wind had gone down. The creek at the crook ran clear and small over the pale stones. He did not speak to them. He put his hand on the cottonwood's bark, then on the top rail of the fence, then in his coat pocket, and he walked back to the house. The family stayed 9 days. The man's hip mended crooked but usable, and a doctor rode out from the county seat and set it a second time, better, and left with quiet praise for the first setting. The woman baked bread in the stove that had been cold for 6 weeks. The boy learned the roan's name and fed her oats from a flat palm, the way Walter had shown him. On the 10th morning, they left in a borrowed wagon with the 2 mules ahead of them, and the woman held Walter's hand a moment at the gate and did not try to say what she meant. Autumn came on fully. The cottonwood at the west fence went the color of a lit lamp and then bare. Walter did not tear the barn down. He replaced the west sill with heartwood cut from his own timber. He straightened the doors. He nailed the curled tin back with square-cut nails from the tin box he had found under the 4th stall, because they were the ones that belonged. The second center post he left exactly as his grandfather had joined it, oak pegged into pine, and he whitewashed it once more, so the peg disappeared again into the wood. On a clear evening in late October, at the hour when the light lays flat and gold along the western stalls, Walter stood in the open south doors, with a tin cup of coffee in one hand, and the roan's halter rope loose in the other. The mare grazed a few feet off, tearing at the short grass by the doorframe. The barn threw a long shadow east across the yard. The creak at the crook made its small, steady sound. A neighbor rode by on the wagon road, slowed, and called across the fence to ask what Walter had settled on doing with the place, now that it was his again. Walter thought a moment. He looked at the barn, and at the cottonwood, and at the mare. "I did not get the ranch back," he said. "I got my grandfather back." The neighbor took off his hat, held it a moment against his chest, put it on again, and rode on. Walter drank the last of the coffee. He led the roan into the barn and closed the doors against the coming cold, and the light in the joined post held a moment longer than the light in the yard, the way old wood will when it has been asked to remember. Thank you for staying with Walter to the end of this road. This was a story about what patience buries and what patience returns. If it moved you, leave a word below, share it with someone who needs it, and follow along for the next tale, a widow, a shuttered mine, and the promise she keeps by lantern light.